June 15, 1944. Dawn broke over the Pacific, painting the sky in streaks of gold and steel. On the deck of a Japanese airbase in the Mariana Islands, commanders leaned over maps, their fingers trembling as they tracked the distant silhouettes climbing higher and higher, US B-29 superfortresses, massive and relentless, ascending far above the reach of their anti-aircraft guns. Alarm bells echoed through command rooms as officers whispered grimly. Their weapons, once symbols of dominance, were now impotent. The air shimmered with heat and tension, and the horizon trembled with the hum of unseen engines. Panic spread faster than any message could travel. For the first time, these seasoned tacticians faced a terrifying realization. The Americans had found a height they could not touch, and every bomb dropped from above could decide the fate of islands, lives, and empires. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had reached a brutal rhythm of attrition, innovation, and sheer desperation. Japan's defensive network stretched across thousands of islands, from the Solomon Chain to the Marianas. For years, Japanese commanders had relied on layered defenses, fleets of fighters, coastal artillery, and anti-aircraft batteries perched on hills and cliff edges, all meticulously calculated to dominate the skies above their territories. These defenses had once been formidable, capable of turning back waves of enemy bombers with deadly precision. But technology in war rarely stands still. Across the Pacific, U.S. engineers were quietly building something the Japanese could not yet comprehend. A bomber so large, so high-flying, and so heavily armed that it could seemingly ignore the very defenses designed to destroy it. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was no ordinary plane. Its wings stretched wider than many ships docked in Japanese harbors, its engines roared with a mechanical confidence that defied gravity, and its pressurized cabins allowed crews to operate at altitudes unimaginable for the pilots of the early war years. For Japanese commanders who had studied the skies for decades, the B-29 represented an entirely new form of threat. Intelligence reports had begun trickling in, fragmented and sporadic. A reconnaissance pilot might spot the enormous bombers high above, their shadows falling across atolls hundreds of miles away. A radar operator could track their ascent, noticing patterns that defied known performance metrics. These were not ordinary raids. U.S. planners had engineered a bomber capable of staying out of reach while carrying payloads large enough to obliterate military installations, factories, and civilian infrastructure alike. Each report was met with disbelief at first. "It cannot fly that high," some officers murmured. "Our guns can reach any plane that dares over our islands." This disbelief was not unfounded. Japanese anti-aircraft technology had proven lethal in earlier battles. The Type 88 75mm AA gun could send shells hundreds of meters into the sky, tearing apart formations of enemy bombers with devastating accuracy. Paired with radar-assisted targeting, these batteries had decimated incoming waves over the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and even early engagements over China. But the B-29 ceiling, nearly 30,000 feet, rendered these defenses impotent. Each report from observers and pilots revealed a growing pattern. The Americans could climb above the reach of every gun the Japanese had relied on for years. Inside Japanese command rooms, this realization sparked quiet but escalating panic. Officers pored over tables and maps, recalculating ranges, artillery trajectories, and interception protocols. Every new piece of intelligence challenged long-held assumptions. Japan's air strategy had been built around planes engaging at predictable altitudes, fighters swooping down from above or meeting bombers at standard cruising heights. Yet the B-29 refused to follow the script. It was faster than interceptors could climb, higher than guns could fire, and smarter than conventional bombing doctrine had ever accounted for. The very rules of air combat were being rewritten in real time. Meanwhile, the Japanese military faced a stark logistical dilemma. Developing new anti-aircraft guns or higher-reaching fighters required time, a commodity in desperately short supply. Factories capable of producing advanced weaponry had been disrupted by previous raids, shipping lanes were under constant threat from submarines, and raw materials were dwindling. Commanders were acutely aware that every day they delayed adaptation was another day the Americans could gather intelligence, strike strategic targets, and undermine morale on the home islands. The combination of technological superiority and logistical bottlenecks left Japanese leadership trapped between innovation they could not immediately implement and devastation they could not prevent. At the same time, the human element of fear began to seep into the strategy rooms. Seasoned commanders, who had spent decades honing their defensive networks, suddenly confronted the fragile reality of their assumptions. Reports came of bombers arriving with near impunity, crews executing precision strikes while Japanese gunners looked on helplessly. Pilots who had survived countless engagements were now grounded by an enemy that never needed to descend into their range. The psychological impact was profound. Panic, once reserved for the battlefield, now crept into boardrooms and command posts. Decisions slowed, debates became urgent, and every officer could sense that the balance of power in the Pacific was quietly, inexorably shifting. Historical records, including captured communications and diaries from the Mariana Islands, highlight the depth of this anxiety. One officer wrote in his journal, "The sky itself is no longer ours. Each day they rise higher, and each day we lose our grip on the war." It was a statement that underscored more than fear, it captured a transformation. The Japanese defensive mindset, once confident in its ability to control the airspace over its territories, was cracking under the pressure of a machine designed to climb beyond human reach. Yet, there was also a grudging admiration for the engineering prowess behind the B-29. Some officers recognized the ingenuity required to design a bomber that could ascend above nearly every existing threat while carrying unprecedented bomb loads. The pressurized cabins alone were a marvel, allowing crews to operate at altitudes that would have otherwise caused almost certain incapacitation. Each component of the plane, the reinforced wings, the turbo-supercharged engines, and the sophisticated bombing systems, was a reminder that technological evolution could redefine warfare in an instant. This convergence of innovation and panic set the stage for a dramatic confrontation. Japanese commanders had two choices: scramble to adapt, inventing new guns, higher-reaching fighters, and revised interception strategies, or risk watching their islands become vulnerable to precise, unstoppable bombardment. Both paths carried enormous risk. Adaptation required resources Japan no longer fully controlled, while inaction invited devastation from above. The tension between these choices created a silent, pervasive dread that would define every engagement for months to come. By the time the first B-29 raids struck the Marianas, the Japanese were already on edge. Anti-aircraft batteries fired frantically into the sky, their shells climbing after phantom shadows. Pilots scrambled to intercept, but the Americans maintained altitude superiority. Each raid reinforced the terrifying realization: the very heights once thought safe were no longer sanctuaries. The Americans had claimed a dominion in the sky that no gun, no fighter, no strategy could immediately challenge. And for the commanders watching from below, panic was not just an emotion, it was a survival imperative. In short, the arrival of the B-29 superfortress marked more than a technological shift. It symbolized the end of an era in the Pacific. Japanese assumptions about air superiority, once rooted in decades of experience and careful planning, were suddenly obsolete. Every raid that ascended beyond their reach forced a re-evaluation of doctrine, strategy, and capability. The stage was set for confrontation not just of firepower, but of ingenuity, desperation, and human will. This was the context in which Japanese commanders first panicked, trapped between a technological marvel they could not immediately counter and the relentless advance of an enemy who had learned to climb above their guns. It was a panic born not of inexperience, but of a hard, undeniable truth. In war, mastery of the skies can decide the fate of nations, and now, the Americans held the high ground. July 8, 1944. Dawn's first light stretched across Saipan, illuminating rows of anti-aircraft guns and alert crews bracing for the day ahead. The island's Japanese defenders had been anticipating U.S. raids for weeks, poring over intelligence reports, refining flight paths, and rehearsing interception drills. Yet nothing in their training, no calculation, and no expectation could prepare them for the colossal silhouettes appearing high above the horizon, B-29 superfortresses, climbing steadily toward the stratosphere, beyond the reach of every gun in their arsenal. The first wave approached with almost serene precision. Their massive engines hummed rather than roared, an alien sound that carried across the island with an almost mocking calm. From below, the Japanese spotters raised binoculars, faces pale. Each bomber dwarfed any plane they had ever encountered, its wings casting long shadows over the lush landscape. As the aircraft climbed, the ground crews frantically calculated trajectories, adjusting elevation dials on guns that could not reach their targets. Every measurement confirmed the same grim truth: these bombers were untouchable. Desperation took hold. Pilots in Zero fighters scrambled, engines screaming as they attempted to ascend into the thinning air. They reached higher than ever before, pushing aircraft to their structural limits, but even these legendary planes fell short. The B-29s maintained altitude effortlessly, their crews calmly observing the futile maneuvers below. Anti-aircraft shells arced into the sky, exploding in clouds far beneath the bomber's flight path. Each detonation was a reminder of the technological chasm between attacker and defender. Commanders huddled in reinforced bunkers, faces etched with worry lines. Radio operators transmitted frantic updates, but clarity was scarce. The Americans had mastered timing, ascent, and formation flying, rendering conventional Japanese interception strategies almost useless. Every failed attempt to bring down a bomber sparked heated discussions. Should they risk overextending fighters, or accept the bombs falling above their guns? Every decision carried the weight of lives on the islands below, yet the solution seemed as distant as the aircraft themselves. The first bombs struck with devastating accuracy. Military warehouses and supply depots erupted into firestorms, clouds of smoke blotting the sun. From their bunkers, commanders watched helplessly, realizing that altitude superiority was more than a tactical advantage, it was a psychological weapon. Panic spread among gunners and pilots alike. Even seasoned officers, veterans of battles across China and the Philippines, felt their confidence eroding under the unrelenting threat from above. The Americans' tactics only compounded the fear. The B-29s flew in staggered formations, their engineers exploiting altitude ceilings and pressurized cabins to maintain endurance beyond anything the Japanese had seen. Crews calculated every maneuver, timing their climbs and dives to maximize efficiency while staying out of range of anti-aircraft fire. It was a ballet of destruction, executed miles above the helpless defenders. Commanders began noting patterns. Attempts to chase, intercept, or climb after the bombers were consistently outmatched. This was not mere luck, it was the product of engineering mastery and meticulous planning. Every encounter tested Japanese resolve. A single Zero might break through cloud cover to approach a bomber, only to find itself outpaced and outmaneuvered. The B-29's defensive armaments, quadruple .50 caliber machine guns with remote-control turrets, created zones of lethal coverage that further dissuaded bold attacks. Pilots returning from sorties described near-miraculous survivals, recounting machine gun fire that seemed to anticipate every move. Meanwhile below, anti-aircraft crews grew increasingly frustrated, watching shells detonate harmlessly thousands of feet beneath their quarry. The situation on Tinian and Guam was equally grim. Radar operators reported incoming waves, and commanders attempted desperate calculations, hoping for weaknesses. Sometimes, a bomber would adjust altitude or formation, testing Japanese defenses for flaws. Each time, defenders responded with frantic maneuvers, but the Americans remained calm, almost clinical in their execution. Observers noted that the Japanese were not merely failing to hit their targets, they were losing control of the entire engagement. The B-29's altitude allowed it to strike almost at will, and the psychological effect was profound. Casualties mounted on both sides, but not in the way the Japanese had anticipated. While pilots and crews on the ground suffered from the bombings, the real blow was to morale. Commanders struggled to maintain composure as reports confirmed that even experienced gunners could not reach the high-flying bombers. Each raid forced a grim reassessment of strategy. Traditional defense grids, once the backbone of island security, were proving ineffective. The very instruments that had once inspired confidence, anti-aircraft calculations, fighter deployment plans, and coordinated radar networks, now seemed inadequate. Amid the chaos, individual acts of ingenuity emerged. Some Japanese pilots attempted daring vertical dives from extreme altitude to surprise the bombers, risking structural failure of their aircraft. Others experimented with synchronized attacks, coordinating multiple Zeros to strike in waves. Yet each tactic revealed the same brutal truth. The B-29's design allowed it to adapt faster than the defenders could react. Every innovative maneuver from the Japanese was met with calm, methodical adjustments from the Americans, reinforcing the sense that the high-flying bombers were untouchable. Reports of B-29 raids began filtering to Tokyo with alarming clarity. Commanders in the capital read with disbelief about islands being struck with near impunity. Intelligence officers emphasized the altitude problem, noting repeatedly that guns simply could not reach these bombers. Strategic meetings turned tense, debates sharp, and a sense of urgency replaced measured confidence. The Japanese military, long accustomed to dominance in the skies over its Pacific holdings, faced an unsettling reality. The B-29 had fundamentally altered the rules of engagement. By late July, The cycle of fear, experimentation, and failure had become routine. Every day, new raids challenged existing defenses. Anti-aircraft crews were trained to shoot higher, pilots pushed machines to the limit, and command posts revised strategies in real time. Yet the Americans' mastery of altitude and endurance continued to outpace these efforts. The Japanese were learning, but each lesson came at a high cost, reinforcing the perception that their guns, fighters, and calculations were inadequate against this new breed of bomber. This relentless series of encounters was shaping more than the immediate battle, it was reshaping Japanese military doctrine. Commanders began to discuss entirely new designs for anti-aircraft weapons and interceptors capable of reaching unprecedented altitudes. Yet every proposal clashed with logistical realities. Materials were scarce, factories were overextended, and time was slipping away. The fear that had begun with the first sight of B-29s now evolved into strategic desperation, a pervasive anxiety that colored every decision. By the end of July, the early encounters had left a clear imprint on the war. Japanese commanders understood that they faced an enemy who could operate above their reach, strike at will, and remain largely invulnerable. Each raid validated the terrifying truth: the Americans had seized control of a new dimension of warfare. The skies above the Pacific were no longer a battleground the Japanese could dominate. They had become a domain defined by an adversary whose technological edge was undeniable, and whose reach could not be countered with existing weapons or strategies. And yet, the Americans themselves were not without risk. Flying at extreme altitudes strained crews, pushed engines to their limits, and required meticulous coordination to avoid catastrophic mistakes. Each raid was a calculated gamble. One miscalculation, one mechanical failure, and an untouchable plane could crash in flames into the very islands it was meant to terrorize. The stakes were colossal, the margin for error razor-thin. The tension of these early encounters extended not only to the defenders on the ground, but also to the crews braving the heights above, a silent contest of endurance, technology, and nerve. By the time the sun dipped behind the horizon each day, Japanese commanders were left with stark realizations. Their guns had limits, their fighters had ceilings, and their confidence was no longer enough. Every B-29 raid reinforced the necessity of rapid adaptation, strategic innovation, and perhaps most painfully, the acceptance that a new era of warfare had arrived, one defined by machines that could climb higher, strike farther, and defy the defenses that once seemed invincible. August 12, 1944. Over the Marianas, a faint blue haze hung across the horizon, softening the sun's glare. But in the command bunkers below, there was no softness, only tension, crackling radios, and the relentless ticking of uncertainty. Japanese commanders had been tracking unusual flight patterns for weeks. Radar blips streaked across screens, climbing higher than ever recorded. Today, the reality they had feared would finally crystallize. The B-29 was no anomaly, it was a strategic revolution in motion. From a high vantage point atop a cliff on Saipan, observers watched the incoming formation, a string of massive bombers glinting in the morning sun. Each plane's climb was methodical, unhurried, yet impossibly high. The anti-aircraft crews, their fingers white around triggers and rangefinders, calculated trajectories one last time. Every number confirmed the unthinkable. These bombers would ascend beyond the reach of every gun, every fighter, every tactic they had relied upon for years. The first shells arced into the sky, exploding in clouds far below the B-29's cruising altitude. The crews aboard the bombers barely noticed. From their vantage, the island appeared distant, a miniature model of lush greenery and structures, vulnerable yet powerless against the machinery above. The hum of engines filled the cabin, almost soothing in its consistency, while navigators adjusted flight paths with surgical precision. Here was the turning point. The Americans had not just designed a bomber, they had engineered invulnerability in 3 dimensions. Inside Japanese command posts, the mood was electric with fear. Officers had long rehearsed contingency plans for attacks, but those scenarios assumed engagement at altitudes within reach of their guns. Now, every calculation was rendered obsolete. One general, consulting a chart tracking bomber altitude against anti-aircraft range, slammed his fist against the table. "They climb beyond every measure we have," he shouted, a rare break from stoic discipline. The realization was universal. The B-29s could strike at will while the defenders were left impotent, their weapons effectively ceremonial. Word came of the first bomb drops. Warehouses and fuel depots erupted into flames, sending plumes of smoke swirling toward the sky. Ground troops ducked for cover as explosions rattled the earth. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. If bombs could fall from altitudes beyond the reach of defensive fire, then the very notion of control, the lifeblood of military command, was gone. Panic, which had been quietly simmering for weeks, ignited into overt alarm. For the first time, seasoned officers openly questioned the viability of their defensive network. The human cost was evident. Reports streamed in of destroyed airfields, damaged runways, and supply caches reduced to rubble. Pilots and crews on the ground were immobilized, their fighters rendered ineffective against targets that were simultaneously unreachable and unstoppable. The B-29 was no longer just a technological marvel, it was a symbol of a new kind of warfare, one that allowed destruction from above while minimizing risk to the attacker. The Japanese realized that this was not merely a tactical problem, it was a strategic crisis. In desperation, some commanders attempted extreme measures. Pilots were ordered to push Zero fighters to limits never tested before, climbing to altitudes that stressed airframes and engines. Anti-aircraft crews modified firing solutions, attempting to elevate shells to impossible heights. Each maneuver carried enormous risk, but the B-29's engineering superiority continued to outmatch these desperate efforts. Plan after plan failed, each loss reinforcing the terrifying lesson: mastery of altitude was the key to dominance in this new theater of war. This realization reached the upper echelons of the Japanese military. In Tokyo, war councils convened, reviewing intelligence reports and intercepted communications. Experts analyzed flight patterns, engine performance, and bomb loads. The conclusions were unanimous and devastating. The Americans had created a bomber that combined endurance, altitude, and payload in a combination the Japanese could not immediately counter. For the first time, Japanese military planners confronted a truth they could not ignore: without rapid innovation, their defensive doctrine would crumble under a barrage they could not reach or repel. On the islands, the effect was immediate. Ground commanders began issuing frantic orders, coordinating scattered anti-aircraft units and fighter squadrons in last-ditch attempts to intercept the next wave. The B-29s, however, anticipated these reactions. Crews adjusted altitude and formation subtly, exploiting gaps in radar coverage and defensive positioning. Each raid became a psychological chess match, with the Americans consistently operating several moves ahead. The Japanese were learning, but every lesson came at a high cost in lives and infrastructure. An observer stationed near a key airfield recorded the scene with meticulous detail. We watched them rise, and knew that nothing we had could reach them. We fired. They climbed. We aimed. They climbed higher. Fear, real, tangible fear, gripped us all. The guns, the calculations, even the bravest pilots, they were useless against this new height. These first-hand accounts capture the emotional core of the turning point. Panic was no longer merely an internal feeling. It was a measurable operational reality that shaped every decision and dictated the tempo of defense. The revelation forced Japanese commanders to think differently. Traditional doctrines emphasized interception at predictable altitudes, coordinated fighter sweeps, and layered anti-aircraft defenses. Now they had to consider possibilities beyond reach, altitude ceilings that could no longer be crossed, and enemy tactics that operated outside their established parameters. Every meeting, every discussion, became an exercise in improvisation. Strategies that had once seemed invincible now appeared naive, and a sense of vulnerability permeated every layer of command. Yet, within this panic, a grudging respect emerged. Officers acknowledged the ingenuity required to design the B-29. Its pressurized cabins allowed crews to function at altitudes where humans normally could not survive. Turbo-supercharged engines provided consistent power in thin air, while reinforced structures ensured the bombers could endure the stress of extreme climbing and extended missions. Defensive armaments, arranged to cover virtually every angle, allowed crews to maintain a tactical advantage even in isolation. Japanese commanders recognized that defeating such a machine would require more than incremental adjustments. It demanded innovation, resources, and time they did not have. This stark realization set in motion a cascade of responses. Factories were pushed to produce higher-reaching AA guns, experimental interceptors were proposed, and communication networks were overhauled to improve reaction times. Yet every adaptation lagged behind the Americans' next move. Each B-29 raid reinforced the gap, proving that technological ingenuity could not merely supplement strategy, it could dominate it entirely. Japanese commanders were trapped in a race they could not win by conventional means, and every delay magnified the consequences. By mid-August, the psychological effect on the defenders had reached a tipping point. Crews reported hesitation in firing at distant silhouettes, fearing wasted ammunition and futile exposure. Pilots questioned the effectiveness of their climbs, engineers doubted the ability of new guns to reach sufficient altitude, and officers debated whether island fortifications could survive repeated raids beyond their reach. The realization that U.S. bombers could operate above the maximum effective range of existing defenses became a defining moment of the Pacific Campaign. The American perspective underscores the turning point's significance. Crews trained for months to exploit altitude advantages, testing engines, calibrating altimeters, and coordinating defensive gun placements. For them, each successful raid was confirmation that engineering mastery could override even the most disciplined, experienced defenses. They understood that the psychological impact on enemy command structures was as potent as any physical destruction. Every bomb that fell from untouchable heights reinforced the notion that altitude supremacy could dictate the rhythm and outcome of war. For Japanese commanders, the emotional weight was undeniable. Diaries and intercepted messages reveal a mix of disbelief, frustration, and grim determination. One entry reads, "We have faced many enemies, but none that can rise above our guns. Each day they come, we are forced to watch, powerless. What is defense if you cannot reach the sky?" These words capture the essence of the turning point, a moment where technology reshaped strategy, and panic became a tangible, operational force in the conflict. As the sun set over the islands, the consequences of this revelation became clear. The B-29 had transformed the battlefield, not by overwhelming numbers, but by redefining the very parameters of engagement. Japanese defenses, no matter how carefully constructed, had been rendered incomplete by altitude alone. Panic, which had begun as uncertainty, had evolved into strategic paralysis. Commanders realized that without radical adaptation, the Americans would continue to dominate the skies with impunity, striking at will while remaining largely untouchable. This turning point was not a single moment, but a series of cascading realizations and encounters. Each raid reinforced the lesson that the Americans' technological and tactical mastery of altitude had shifted the balance irrevocably. The Japanese had trained for air superiority in the context of older aircraft, predictable altitudes, and layered defenses. The B-29 had changed those parameters entirely, forcing a fundamental reassessment of what defense meant, what risk meant, and what survival meant. By the end of August, the Marianas had become a proving ground for the consequences of this revelation. Each engagement underscored the terrifying effectiveness of altitude as both a shield and a weapon. Japanese commanders were left with no illusions. The Americans had achieved an advantage that could not be countered with incremental improvements. The war in the Pacific had entered a new phase, defined by technological escalation, psychological pressure, and the stark, undeniable reality that control of the skies was no longer a given. It had to be seized, and the Americans had already claimed the high ground. September 18, 1944. The morning sun shimmered over Tinian, casting long shadows across the sprawling airfields. Japanese commanders, still haunted by weeks of reconnaissance and failed interceptions, braced for what would become the most audacious B-29 raid yet. Intelligence had predicted the bomber formation's flight path and altitude with alarming accuracy. Yet even with every calculation in hand, there was a collective sense of dread. The Americans had perfected their high-altitude strategy, and this would test the limits of Japanese defenses, and the courage of the men manning them. From the observation posts, the first silhouettes appeared, piercing the dawn mist like steel ghosts. 40, then 60, then nearly 100 bombers climbed with deliberate, terrifying calm. Their engines thrummed in a synchronized cadence, a mechanical heartbeat that echoed across the island. Anti-aircraft crews gripped their triggers, their knuckles white with tension. Every elevation dial, every angle of fire, was pushed to its maximum, yet shells exploded far below the bomber's cruising altitude. The Japanese had fought many air battles before, but this was something different. It was a confrontation in which the enemy could almost never be reached. The B-29s held formation, their shadows stretching across the island as they ascended, almost like a fleet of silent leviathans. From below, Japanese pilots attempted a coordinated scramble. Zeros roared off the runways, climbing with engines screaming, wings buffeted by turbulence, adrenaline surging. But even in these desperate attempts, they fell short. Some pilots tried daring maneuvers, banking sharply to anticipate bomber movements, but the altitude advantage of the B-29s rendered these efforts largely symbolic. Every near miss, every failed interception, reinforced the psychological dominance the Americans now exerted from above. On the ground, anti-aircraft batteries fired in waves, the detonations shaking the earth and rattling nearby structures. Yet despite the cacophony, the bombers seemed untouchable. Observers watched as massive explosions of fire and smoke erupted beneath the B-29s, marking the destruction of depots, fuel storage, and strategic installations. The Japanese could see the results, but they could not stop them. Their own defenses, once a source of pride and confidence, had become impotent against a new dimension of warfare. Commanders attempted to coordinate desperate countermeasures. Pilots were instructed to climb higher than ever, engines revved to the point of strain. Anti-aircraft crews recalibrated guns, attempting to compensate for miscalculations and human error. Yet the Americans anticipated almost every adjustment. B-29 navigators altered altitudes and formations subtly, maintaining distance from threats while ensuring precision over their targets. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, but in this encounter, the cat could not reach its prey. The tension in command bunkers was palpable. Maps, charts, and radar blips cluttered tables, officers shouting orders over crackling radios. Every decision was critical, every delay could mean additional destruction on the islands. Observers noted the unprecedented levels of stress, the physical signs of fear and exhaustion etched into the faces of men accustomed to command. Panic had escalated to a tangible, operational reality. For the first time, Japanese leadership faced not just a tactical problem, but a crisis of existential proportions. Amid this chaos, individual acts of heroism emerged. Pilots and gunners pushed themselves to limits never before attempting coordinated dives and synchronized volleys. Some succeeded in forcing minor course corrections for the bombers, yet the structural and technological superiority of the B-29 rendered such victories fleeting. Each success was a temporary reprieve, immediately followed by the next wave of bombs descending from untouchable heights. The pattern was clear. Every attempt at defense met a counter that exploited Japanese limitations in altitude and endurance. Meanwhile, B-29 crews operated with methodical precision. Each aircraft climbed to optimum altitudes, avoiding flak bursts and fighter approaches with practiced ease. Bombardiers calculated release points with near-perfect accuracy, adjusting for wind, speed, and altitude. The destructive payloads fell in systematic patterns, reducing fuel depots, warehouses, and infrastructure to rubble. From thousands of feet above, the island appeared both miniature and fragile, an island fortress in appearance, yet vulnerable and helpless against the strategic reach of these airborne leviathans. One particularly harrowing episode occurred near a central airfield. A squadron of Zeros attempted a daring vertical interception, climbing to extreme altitudes in a coordinated assault. They approached the formation, engines screaming, but even as they neared the B-29s, the bombers adjusted course, guns opening fire from remote turrets. The Zeros were forced into evasive maneuvers at perilous heights, some exceeding structural limitations. Several pilots barely returned, engines smoking, aircraft damaged, and morale shaken. It was a stark demonstration. For every act of courage, the Americans had a countermeasure calculated from above. The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. Soldiers and commanders on the ground reported fear, confusion, and disorientation. Observers noted a phenomenon rarely recorded before: hesitation in the face of the impossible. Even highly trained anti-aircraft crews occasionally delayed firing, uncertain of their effectiveness against planes beyond reach. Strategic planning meetings became frantic exercises in improvisation. Every new raid reinforced the lesson that altitude, combined with careful engineering, could dictate the tempo of war. Japanese engineers scrambled to find solutions. Proposals were made for new high-ceiling AA guns, experimental interceptors, and revised tactics aimed at exploiting any possible weakness. Factories were pressed to produce modified aircraft capable of climbing higher, while radar networks were adjusted to provide earlier detection. Yet every adaptation lagged behind the Americans' next maneuver. The technological gap had become both physical and temporal. U.S. engineers operated in advance, leaving Japanese planners perpetually reactive. From the air, the B-29 formations maintained an almost eerie calm. Crews executed maneuvers with near-military precision, adjusting for threats and maximizing bombing efficiency. The pressurized cabins allowed pilots to operate comfortably in extreme altitudes, while gunners manned remote turrets with confidence. The synergy of human skill and mechanical superiority made interception a near-impossible task. Each successful raid reinforced a terrifying fact for the Japanese. The Americans had seized the air in a way that was as psychological as it was physical. By midday, the full scope of destruction became visible. Fires spread across warehouses, fuel tanks exploded in pillars of flame, and runways were rendered inoperable. Ground troops and civilians watched helplessly as their island transformed from a fortified stronghold into a target rendered vulnerable by technological and strategic innovation. Japanese commanders convened urgently, weighing every possible response. Options were limited, resources strained, and time slipping away with each passing minute. The stakes could not have been higher. Every raid risked crippling critical infrastructure, diminishing morale, and cementing U.S. air supremacy in the Pacific. The climax of the raid came in the late afternoon. The largest formation yet approached, hundreds of feet above any defensive capability. Japanese batteries fired continuously, shells arcing like desperate hope into the thinning sky. Fighter squadrons executed high-altitude intercepts, pushing aircraft to structural limits in daring vertical maneuvers. Yet the B-29s maintained calm, adjusting altitude and formation with uncanny coordination. Each bomb release struck with precision, devastating key facilities. For the Japanese, this was the moment the reality became undeniable. The enemy had climbed beyond their reach, struck with impunity, and survived to repeat the performance. From bunkers and observation posts, commanders faced a stark truth. Their guns, once symbols of power, were ceremonial. Their fighters, legendary in earlier campaigns, were now outmatched. Every decision, every calculation, every act of courage seemed insufficient against the sheer altitude advantage of the Americans. Panic had escalated to operational paralysis. The high ground was no longer a metaphor, it was a lethal reality that had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific. Yet, even in the midst of this overwhelming crisis, there was a profound lesson embedded in the chaos. The Americans' mastery of altitude, precision, and engineering demonstrated the evolving nature of warfare. Victory was no longer dictated by brute force alone, but by innovation, planning, and the ability to exploit weaknesses invisible to the human eye. For Japanese commanders, this painful lesson came at an enormous cost, but it would forever redefine the strategic calculus of Pacific air defense. As dusk fell, the smoke from burning depots and shattered infrastructure painted the horizon in shades of orange and black. Japanese officers recorded reports, catalogued losses, and attempted to salvage what remained of morale. The B-29s, silhouettes against the fading sky, began their slow, controlled descent back to distant airfields, engines humming with the confidence of invulnerability. For the defenders below, the day's events crystallized into one undeniable fact: the Americans had claimed the high ground, and from it, they could strike with near impunity. In the aftermath, Japanese command posts were left grappling with the enormity of the situation. Anti-aircraft strategy, once rooted in centuries of experience and decades of regional dominance, required complete re-evaluation. Fighter design had to reach beyond previous limits. Doctrine needed rewriting. Every resource, every strategy, every calculation would now be measured against the new standard set by the Americans: altitude supremacy. This peak conflict, the collision of human courage, technological innovation, and strategic panic, marked the defining moment of the B-29's early campaign over the Marianas. It was not merely a battle of planes and guns, but a confrontation that reshaped the psychological, tactical, and operational landscape of the Pacific. For Japanese commanders, the lessons were harsh, immediate, and impossible to ignore. The high-altitude threat had become a defining factor in the war, a force that demanded recognition, adaptation, and respect. And in the skies above, the B-29s returned home, engines humming, formation intact, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a legacy that would echo in every strategic decision for months to come. The balance of power had shifted, and Japanese commanders, once confident in their ability to control the air, now faced the sobering truth: they could no longer touch the planes that climbed higher than their guns. By late September 1944, the Marianas had become a stark illustration of the consequences of altitude supremacy. The island's once formidable defenses had been tested and found wanting. Anti-aircraft batteries, designed for precision and lethality, were rendered largely symbolic. Fighter squadrons, even at their peak performance, struggled to reach the heights where the B-29s operated. The Americans had achieved what Japanese commanders had feared most. They controlled the skies in 3 dimensions, and the consequences were visible in fire, smoke, and shattered morale below. Japanese leadership faced the unflinching reality that conventional defenses were insufficient. Reports compiled from multiple islands painted a picture of destruction: airfields damaged or destroyed, fuel depots consumed in towering infernos, warehouses obliterated, and crucial infrastructure rendered inoperable. More alarming than the physical damage was the psychological toll. Officers reported growing hesitation among gunners, stress-induced errors, and a pervasive sense of inevitability. The air, once a theater they could dominate, had become a domain where the enemy's reach and ingenuity outmatched every tactic they had employed. In response, the Japanese military began to consider radical adaptation. Engineers drafted plans for high-altitude anti-aircraft guns, experimental interceptors capable of reaching unprecedented heights, and coordinated radar networks designed to provide earlier warning of incoming raids. Yet the logistical reality was harsh: resources were scarce, factories overburdened, and time relentlessly slipping away. Every modification lagged behind the Americans' next move. The B-29's combination of altitude, speed, and precision had introduced a technological gap that could not be bridged overnight. The implications extended beyond individual islands. Japanese commanders recognized that the United States had not only secured temporary operational superiority, but had fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the Pacific War. Islands that were previously thought defensible could no longer be guaranteed safe from bombardment. Supply lines, troop concentrations, and even morale on the home islands were now vulnerable to strikes that could be executed with minimal risk to the attackers. This revelation forced a re-evaluation of how Japan approached air defense, resource allocation, and strategic priorities. Yet, amid this daunting reality, the Japanese response was not entirely reactive. Some officers and engineers embraced the challenge, using the lessons of the B-29 raids to inspire innovation. They explored alternative tactics such as coordinated night operations, deceptive decoy positions, and layered interception strategies that aimed to exploit any potential weaknesses in bomber formations. However, each approach was a stopgap measure against an enemy whose engineering had redefined the operational ceiling of warfare. The B-29 was not merely a bomber, it was a psychological weapon, a technological statement that forced the defenders into perpetual adaptation. For the Americans, the outcome of these early raids validated months of meticulous planning, engineering, and training. Crews had learned to exploit altitude and formation to maximize efficiency and minimize vulnerability. They had proven that strategic dominance could be achieved not through numerical superiority alone, but through technological innovation, precise coordination, and psychological impact. Each successful raid reinforced the lesson that in modern warfare, mastery of the environment, especially the skies, could determine the outcome before any shots were even fired. On the ground, Japanese commanders compiled detailed assessments of losses and gaps. Reports highlighted recurring patterns: anti-aircraft fire rarely reached targets, fighter interceptions were inconsistently effective, and psychological strain among crews and officers was steadily increasing. Strategic meetings emphasized that the B-29s were no longer anomalies; they were the future standard of long-range bombing. Defending against them would require a complete overhaul of doctrine, a luxury Japan could scarcely afford in the waning years of the war. The human dimension of this outcome was equally profound. Japanese pilots and ground crews bore the weight of repeated failure. Veteran officers who had commanded squadrons with success in China and the Philippines now faced a sense of impotence. The B-29s had not only destroyed physical targets, but also challenged the confidence and authority of leadership. Diaries and intercepted messages reveal the emotional toll: frustration, fear, and a dawning recognition that traditional methods of defense were obsolete. For the first time, many questioned whether their efforts could meaningfully influence the outcome of the air war. Despite these challenges, some pockets of adaptation emerged. Engineers experimented with engine modifications, reinforced airframes, and higher performance fighters. Anti-aircraft crews attempted innovative firing techniques, calculated with painstaking precision. While these efforts could not immediately neutralize the B-29 threat, they demonstrated a resilience and determination that underscored the adaptability of human ingenuity in the face of overwhelming technological odds. Even in defeat, these measures provided invaluable lessons for the evolving nature of aerial warfare. The B-29 raids also set a precedent for strategic bombing campaigns in the Pacific. Their success emphasized the importance of altitude, endurance, and precision in shaping the course of military operations. Future missions would refine these principles, extending the Americans' reach deeper into Japanese-held territories and eventually toward the home islands themselves. In essence, the outcome of these early engagements was not only the immediate physical destruction of infrastructure, but also the establishment of a blueprint for air superiority that would define the remainder of the conflict. By the end of September, Japanese commanders had fully internalized the ramifications. Defensive doctrines were revised, resources reallocated, and new initiatives undertaken, yet the central challenge remained unchanged. The B-29 could operate beyond the effective range of traditional weapons, striking with devastating efficiency. The realization marked a pivotal shift in the Pacific War, a recognition that technology and altitude could dictate the tempo and outcome of battles, and that strategic adaptation was no longer optional but essential for survival. Ultimately, the outcome of this phase of the campaign was both material and psychological. Islands had been physically damaged, yes, but more importantly, Japanese military leadership had experienced a crisis of confidence that would shape subsequent operations. The Americans had demonstrated that mastery of the high ground, the literal high ground of altitude, could redefine power dynamics in war. The B-29 was not merely a plane, it was a harbinger of a new era in aerial combat, one in which innovation, precision, and psychological impact converged to achieve results that brute force alone could not. For Japanese commanders, the lessons were clear and unambiguous. Adaptation was no longer a choice, hesitation was a liability, and every defense had to be measured against the reality that the enemy could now strike from heights previously thought untouchable. This outcome, the fusion of destruction, psychological pressure, and strategic revelation, would echo throughout the remainder of the Pacific campaign, influencing the design of aircraft, the deployment of anti-aircraft artillery, and the very way the Japanese approached aerial warfare. The resolution of this chapter was as much about recognition as it was about consequence. The Americans had successfully demonstrated the power of altitude, precision, and engineering to dictate outcomes in modern warfare. Japanese commanders had been forced to confront the limits of their technology, the inadequacy of established doctrines, and the psychological weight of a threat they could not reach. In this crucible of fire, smoke, and calculation, the stage was set for further escalation, innovation, and confrontation, a high-stakes interplay that would define the skies over the Pacific for months to come. As the sun set over the Marianas, the smoke from destroyed depots and shattered runways painted the horizon in streaks of orange and black. The islands, scarred and battered, bore silent witness to a new reality. The war in the Pacific had entered an era defined by altitude, innovation, and unrelenting precision. Japanese commanders had learned a painful lesson. The enemy could strike beyond reach, reshape the battlefield, and dominate the skies without ever coming within the grasp of traditional defenses. The B-29 superfortress had done more than deliver bombs. It had delivered revelation. Each ascent beyond anti-aircraft range, each successful mission with surgical accuracy, demonstrated the power of human ingenuity harnessed to technological mastery. From the pressurized cabins to the turbo-supercharged engines, every design choice allowed the Americans to command the skies in a way that was both physical and psychological. The Japanese could see the destruction, feel the helplessness, and understand in a visceral way that the rules of aerial warfare had been rewritten. For those on the ground, the impact was immediate and profound. Fear had become strategy. Hesitation became a factor in decision-making. Every calculation carried the weight of potential devastation. Commanders realized that altitude was no longer just a measurement, it was a weapon, a shield, and a force multiplier. The B-29's dominance illustrated that control of the air was not merely about numbers or firepower, but about innovation, adaptability, and foresight. Yet amid the destruction and panic, there was a quiet recognition of brilliance. Japanese officers, despite their desperation, could not deny the elegance of the strategy. They had faced an enemy who had engineered invincibility into the skies themselves. The lesson was stark. In modern warfare, mastery of technology and terrain, be it land, sea, or air, could determine the fate of nations. Adaptation was no longer optional, it was survival. The story of the B-29 over the Marianas is more than a tale of bombs and explosions. It is a story of perspective, of human ingenuity confronting the limits of established defense, and of the psychological weight of being unable to reach an adversary. It reminds us that in war, advantage can be measured not only in firepower, but in altitude, timing, and innovation. And as the last of the bombers disappeared into the clouds, Japanese commanders were left to stare upward, humbled by the new heights of warfare. The sky, once a domain they could control, had become a realm dominated by an adversary who had learned to climb higher than their guns. And with that, the very rules of battle had forever changed.